Hello, and welcome to the Inside Writing Podcast. I am your host, Josh Sippie. As a reminder, all of these episodes are recorded live Wednesdays, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You can sign up on the Gotham Writers website for free. Now then, on to the show. Today, we're talking with SB Divya. Divya is a Nebula-nominated author of speculative fiction, novellas, and novels, with work appearing in Lightspeed, Analog, and more. Her novella Machinehood earned a Publisher's Weekly starred review. She is also the co-editor of the Hugo-nominated literary magazine and podcast Escape Pod. Divya, welcome to the show.
Hi, Josh. Thanks so much for having me here.
Of course. Thank you for being here. So, Divya, you've got quite the creative portfolio, both as a writer and as an editor. But I want to start at the beginning and ask you, what was that creative spark that sort of kicked off this creative path for you?
The earliest creative spark was way back in 8th grade English class when we had a writing assignment to write a short story. And I was already deep into science fiction as a reader and a fan at that point. And so naturally, I wrote a little bit of science fiction. And at the end of the exercise, we traded with a partner at our table and read and critiqued each other's work. And happened to be a friend of mine, and she read my story, which definitely ended with one of those Lady and the Tiger type of cliffhangers, and told me that I had not finished the story, and she insisted that I should keep writing it. And so I did. I never finished writing it, but I wrote, many chapters, just kind of rambling through, and I loved it. But then writing at that age in my teenage years never struck me as a viable career. I'm pretty sure my parents would not have approved. They thought my writing was great, but they were like, you got to do something that makes, real money. And so I discovered a passion for science as well. And so for many years, I pursued science and then engineering before cycling back to writing much later in my life. And the inspiration for the second time around was a couple of things. I had always wanted to go back and resume writing science fiction. I just figured I'd do it as a retirement hobby and not as a profession. But, in my 30s, I had a kid. I lost a couple of friends to cancer, and I realized that, life doesn't always go the way you think it's going to go, and that writing was something I still really loved, and that kind of re-energized me and gave me space to be myself apart from being an engineer and a wife and a mother. And so I decided to start writing again and actually try to get published. And it's been a pretty wild ride these last 8 years since that happened.
So between that 8th grade assignment and when you picked up writing again, were you still engaged in your creativity at all? Or is it kind of just like, I'll get to this later?
The last piece of fiction I completed was sophomore year of college for a creative writing class I took, which was a short story. And then after that, I was just up to my eyeballs in quantum mechanics and neuroscience and just trying to keep my grades up. And once I started working, I dabbled here and there, but I never really put the time in to finish anything. The writing I did was on LiveJournal. And so I kept up semi-public, just, friends locked journal entries about the goings on and the happenings in my life. And that was my outlet. It wasn't what I would call creative most of the time, but it kind of scratched that itch, and I think it kept up my writing skills in terms of exposition, at least. But no, I took basically a 15-year hiatus between that creative writing class in sophomore year, and actually the first Gotham class I took is what spurred me to finish another short story for the first time in my life after that many years. Yeah.
So I want to get back to that in a bit, but I want to talk about, because you spent, like you said, I think it was 20 years being an engineer. I mean, you write science fiction. Do you feel like your years as an engineer, has that influenced your writing at all?
For sure. I draw on my background, especially because it was a fairly broad education. I went to Caltech and I started as a physics major, much like half the incoming class. I intended to go into astrophysics, and then I ended up diverting halfway through my undergraduate to do computational neuroscience. So I have biology, electrical engineering, and physics and astronomy, all of which are, fantastic foundations for writing um, the harder type of science fiction, right? Where you're really kind of trying to make it realistic or plausible or pull on, current cutting edge sort of questions that are looming in science to come up with creative answers to. And so one of the best things about writing science fiction for me has been that I now have an excuse to make time to go and read research papers, which, as an engineer for a long time, I was really away from research. I was doing, much more just coding and development, chip development, that kind of thing. And now, because I write science fiction, it's like, ooh, I get to dig into some obscure part of astronomy or dark matter or quantum tunneling effects or all kinds of biotech engineering. So really, whatever interests me, I can spend time reading about it, and I get to call it work, and I love it.
Right. I'm always so curious with writers who have had a career and then go into full-time writing, like what the transition was like, because you clearly always had this creative impulse. You got it very, very young. At what point in your career as an engineer were you like, you know what, it's time to actually make that switch and become a full-time writer?
I have kind of been flip-flopping, honestly. Back in 2016, when I had sold my novella Runtime, I decided to quit full-time work and just be a consultant. So I was coming in one day a week at my previous job just to kind of help them transition and train up new people. And I did that for about a year. And the following year, while I was technically consulting for them, they didn't really have anything for me. So I was basically full-time writing in 2017. That's when I drafted Machine Hood, which was my first full-length novel. And then actually in 2018, I went back to work part-time in engineering and quit at the beginning of this year so that I could focus on the release of Machine Hood, because it was my debut novel. It was out, in hardcover. It had a much broader release and more publicity than Runtime did. And so I really wanted to make sure I had the bandwidth to do that. And for a variety of reasons, I haven't gone back to any engineering work. I haven't totally closed the door on it. Um, but by the same token, writing is going well enough at this point that I am not in any urgent need of going back to work. And luckily, financially we're stable. My spouse still works, so we have health benefits. All the essential stuff is covered. And so I'm calling myself, partly a consultant and partly a semi-retired engineer at this point. But you never know. And honestly, the transition happened slowly. So it kind of overlapped. When I first started writing in 2013, I was doing it just like an hour a day, usually after putting my toddler to bed, and then spent a little time with my husband. And after he went to bed, I would sit and write for an hour or so at night. And it kind of gradually built up as I had successes. Like, once I sold the novella, I cut back my hours, and then I did that transition to consulting. When I went back to work in 2018, I was very upfront with the people who were hiring me. It was a small startup. So I told them, look, I have this writing career going. It is definitely a priority when it comes to, deadlines. I will try to juggle both, but I'm not going to give up on that. And therefore, I'd like to come in part-time, and very, very lucky to get a part-time engineering job. Those are kind of like unicorns. So it's been a process, I think, and I know a lot of other writers who have kept their day job, so to speak, just because, especially if you start writing, much earlier in your life, you kind of, it's good to have that paycheck. While full-time writing sounds wonderful and very romantic, at the end of the day, it's like you got to pay your rent, you got to buy food, and being stressed out about writing income, which is very, very unpredictable, can often be a creative block. That's actually one of the reasons I went back to work in 2018, was that my spouse had also left his stable job to join a startup, and I didn't feel like we had enough financial security at that point. So I wanted to go back, and I literally for a couple months just couldn't work on my novel. I couldn't write because I was too stressed out about reality. And once I had that part-time steady income, I was able to focus again.
Now, I want to get back to that in a second, but I wanted to also rewind because you'd said when you sold your first novella, that's when you decided to scale back your hours. You make that sound like it's such an easy thing. Like in your brain, were you thinking like, well, now that I've seen that I can sell my work, I know that this will come more frequently, or I'm sure there was still a risk involved whenever you made that decision?
There definitely was, and that's why I kind of kept one foot in technology. By continuing to consult for my prior company, I didn't have any gaps in my resume so that if I did want to go back and get another job, I could say, look, I've been doing, I have still been doing technical work. I still know how to do it. It still feels like a risk sometimes. There's no guarantees. I had my debut novel come out in March of this year, and a month later, my editor turned down my next book. And so it went on submission again. And it's been months and has only recently resolved itself in a way that I can't talk about publicly yet. But I have finally sold it. But you can't predict, with writing unless you have a multi-book deal, and even then, the income again is uneven, and there's no guarantees that your publisher is going to pick up the next project that you've written. So unless you're like an absolute bestseller, it's always a risk, I think, walking away from that paycheck. And so having this sort of hedge, I guess, in my life of being able to do some sort of part-time work or some sort of contract work has helped with that, with the fear of making the transition. The harder thing for me, I think, has been just internalizing the identity, because I spent so much of my life being an engineer, being in science, and, that's who I was. Doubly so as, a woman and a woman of color in a field which is male dominated. It had really become a core part of my identity. And now when somebody asks me what I do, I still say, well, I've been an engineer up until January, because I can't quite completely let that go. And then I say, but I'm also a writer. And everybody's always more excited about the book writing part, like inevitably, whether it's my former coworkers, whether it's alumni from Caltech, or whether it's just, a random person I've just met. People are much more excited to meet someone who's the author of a book than someone who's an engineer. But it's still kind of, I guess, important to me to kind of hold on to that part of my life.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're a self-professed lover of science and math. So I'm curious why did writing, I don't want to say win out because you still do hold on to that part, but why did writing take so much more priority in your life than the science and math part of it?
At this point, it's just because it's sort of act two of my life. I see it as my second career. So I feel like I had a fulfilling career in technology. I got to the level of a senior engineer. There wasn't much further for me to advance on that career track unless I went into management. So I kind of capped out. And that was one of the other reasons I started writing again, because I felt like I wasn't having that sense of learning and discovery with my work, with my technical work. And so I was looking for it elsewhere. And writing has just, it's a dream, right? At least for me, it was always a dream. And so being able to say I'm living that dream is pretty awesome. And frankly, I am enough of an introvert that sitting around at home with my cat on my couch and some music and my laptop and just disappearing into a story for 4 or 5 hours a day is absolutely divine. Like I I have a kid who gets me out of the house, so I do interact with other human beings periodically. But otherwise, it's like, yeah, I don't miss, driving to an office. We've seen that, I think, with the pandemic too, right? A lot of people don't miss driving to the office every day. It's good to interact with other human beings, but writing has just been a really fulfilling way to pass my midlife and will hopefully take me kind of into my sunset years.
So I want to rewind a little bit because you mentioned taking a Gotham class, which I would be remiss if I didn't go back and visit that. So where were you as a writer when that point came that you were like, I need something more. I need this next step to get me to where I want to get to?
I was just beginning. I took this lovely class called Mondo Biondo, Dream Big, at the recommendation of a friend in the early part of 2013. And that kind of rekindled my, my dream of writing science fiction that I had shelved for so long, right? It was very dusty and forgotten for a long time. And I decided that I needed some assistance. I hadn't taken an English class in forever. And because I had a 3-year-old and a full-time job, I couldn't, run off to the local university or wherever and start taking classes. I just didn't have that kind of time in my day. So I looked for something online, and that's how I came across Gotham, which was not just an online course, it was completely asynchronous. So there was no live teaching element whatsoever. And I was like, that's perfect. That is exactly what I need so that I can do the assignments, on my own time, wherever I can fit it in. And I signed up for it, and, it's science fiction and fantasy level 1. And the first thing you have to do is turn in a short story to be critiqued. So literally for the first time since sophomore year of college, I sat down and finished a short story. Like, I had this graveyard of short stories I'd kind of begun and abandoned along the way, like just 2 or 3 of them here and there. And this time I was like, no, I actually have to get to the end. Like, I have to complete this, and it has to be a real ending. It can't be some 8th grade cliffhanger. And that was the first piece of fiction I had completed in 15 years at that point. And that really kind of kickstarted this whole journey, because I didn't want to just dabble, as I had been through my teens, occasionally in my 20s and 30s. I said, no, this time I really want to see if I can get published and become a professional author. And so I finished that first class. And then I started doing a little bit more on my own. I wrote some flash fiction pieces, and I submitted them to magazines towards the end of 2013. I started collecting my first, first rejections are the worst, because you have no calluses, you have no scars, you have no experience, and they hit you super hard, or at least they hit me super hard. But I persevered. And in February of 2014, I sold my first flash fiction piece to Daily Science Fiction, which got me into an online speculative fiction writers group, which was fantastic because it was for up-and-coming writers. And so I learned so much from that cohort. They had lots of contests just for fun and motivation. And that's how I ended up writing my novella that November of 2014, and a few months later discovered there were open submissions at Tor.com, and said, sure. At that point, I think I had 2 flash fiction pieces to my name. I was like, they're not gonna buy my novella, but I don't have anything else to do with it, so I'll throw it in their submissions box and forget about it, which is exactly what happened. I sold nothing else that entire year. I actually made a bet with someone at the World Science Fiction Convention in August that I wasn't going to sell another story for the rest of the year. And 2 weeks later, I received an offer from them to buy the novella. And yeah, that kind of, that really started a change in my life. At that same time in 2015, I was taking science fiction and fantasy level 2. Because I hadn't sold anything for a while, I was like, oh, maybe I need to level up, my skills. I'm missing something. And so I was actually in the middle of that class when I received the contract. So that was super fun.
Great. So, I feel like there's always, I mean, as writers, we always struggle with self-doubt, but was there a moment in there where you were like, you know what, I can actually do this. This is something I can do.
Every time I sell something, I feel that. And every time I go through a dry spell, which inevitably happens, I feel the opposite. It's like, oh my gosh, have I peaked? Is it over? Am I ever going to sell anything again? And it's just, I think it's just this process we go through, right? Like you're riding the high of a sale or a release or an award nomination, and then you're in the depths of despair because nobody wants to buy anything you've written, and where will you go from here? And it's just, I tell people that writing is, as a career, is like a roller coaster. There's just these massive ups and downs, and you're constantly riding them versus having, a steady paycheck with a reasonably well-defined path of advancement. You do your job, you do it well, especially with engineering. It's like, it's code, it's a device. It either works and meets its functional specifications or it doesn't. There's not a lot of subjectivity. Writing is the exact opposite. Some editor somewhere has to love your story in order to want to buy it. And that's really up to them. And there's, no amount of, well, there's a certain amount of baseline skill you need, but beyond that, there's nothing you can do that's going to guarantee a sale of anything that you write. And that can be really hard to contend with, at least for someone of my personality type and, coming from that particular place of engineering, that career that I'd been in for so long. It's weird. It's still weird sometimes to sit here and be like, I could just go back and start earning this much money every year. Like, why am I putting myself through this? But, I love the feeling of having people read my work. Like, that's ultimately what it's about, changing their lives. I get emails from people about certain stories I've written, that they really related to it, that they loved seeing someone like them in fiction. They never expected that. These are the things that keep me going.
And we all, as writers, like you said, we all go through those dips. What do you do when you're in those dips to keep going? I mean, everybody handles it differently. They all have their own ways of adapting, but what do you do to keep yourself inspired? And you kind of already mentioned how it's something you love, so you're going to keep doing it. But are there anything that you do when you're in those ruts that sort of helps get you out of it?
Yeah, a couple of things. And I have learned some of this from talking to other writers and, taking their wisdom. Sometimes you just need a break. It's easy when you're your own boss and for something like writing to kind of keep cracking the whip, like, no, I must be productive. I must always be writing, write every day, blah, blah, blah. That's not always true. Writers can also burn out, and sometimes you just need to walk away and find the things that made you love stories in the first place, whether it's movies or binge watching Netflix for a couple weeks or just, reading novels outside of what you already write. It's not, or reading outside of research or comps, right? Like finding things that you're just doing for pleasure. That's something that's definitely helped me when I'm really in the depths of depression. The other thing is to let go of any idea of what you should write and write something for fun. I know a lot of writers who do fan fiction on the side, and that helps them recharge when they are struggling with, their professional work. And this summer when I was grinding my teeth and crying my tears over nobody buying my new novel, I started writing a fantasy retelling of Rumpelstiltskin, which, is completely away from the sort of near future or even far future science fiction that I do. It is an idea that had been percolating for a few years. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to write this. I'm writing it for myself. It's not for any anthology call. It's not, I don't care if it never sells. I just want to write something fun and different just to recharge, just for me. And so, yeah, so these are kind of the different ways I guess you keep that creative spark going. And sometimes, just take a vacation. It's just like any other job, and get away from it all to whatever helps recharge your soul, whether it's lying on a beach or going on a cruise. Not always easy in the middle of a pandemic, but for me, I love being out in nature and just getting out, into the woods and tromping around and, do the things that make you happy, and then eventually the creativity will find its way back.
Mhm. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to revisit it, where you mentioned the change whenever you became a full-time writer. I'm curious how your process as a writer changed, and did it become easier to write? 'Cause I know for some writers, like when they transition into having more time, it's almost like they have too much time and they don't know what to do with it. Did you have any of that whenever you first transitioned into having more time to write?
Not really, because I think because the transition happened slowly, and the way I started writing, it was already so structured with my time and very, very intentional. I was not a weekend warrior. I didn't sit down and just binge write for 6 hours on a Saturday. I couldn't do that because I had a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old. It's like I had other demands on my time during the day. So I always just kind of grabbed whatever pieces of time I could. Sometimes it was lunch break, or like while my kid was in ballet class, sit there 15, 20 minutes and just write. When everything kind of opened up in 2016, at the beginning we were actually in the middle of a major home remodel, so I still wasn't completely free, though I did have all day. I made an accountability group. It was me and two other writers who had also gone full time at the same time. And so we had weekly check-ins with each other, and we committed to what we were going to work on the following week. And then when we checked in, did we actually accomplish what we said? And so that kept me a little bit more motivated and accountable to actually get the writing done. Peer pressure is a great tool as long as they're supportive and not mean about it. So that kind of got me in that habit. And then I also had structure because I had a school-aged kid, right? So there was not as much time as you might think between, the hours of 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. when she was in class. So I knew that, once I picked her up, that's it. My day was over. And so that I think also kind of helped me, and that continues to this day, helps me kind of compress and be very intentional about my writing time. And finally, I use a tool called Freedom to block my distractions, and it's pre-scheduled for my core hours from 10 to 2. No social media, no YouTube, no Netflix, like everything's blocked off. For a while, I was even blocking off email, anything that might distract me and, help me stay focused on the writing.
One thing I always love to ask science fiction writers, because you write into the future, and especially with near future, I'm always curious how you handle, like in a sense, you're predicting the future. Now, maybe you don't see it that way, but do you ever feel pressure to like build a future that looks like, so many futures are very bleak. They're always like, sometimes they're not. Like I know with Machinehood, it's set in 2095. Humanity is dependent on various pills for an optimal life. How much of that was you sort of just building a good story, and how much of it was you seeing where humanity could go? Or does that factor into it at all?
It was a bit of both. I spent some time up front trying to decide where I think humanity is going to go in the next 75 years. And I did some research. I actually did a little outline of each decade in terms of, the technology, the geopolitics, the social upheavals. I knew up front that this was going to be a book about AI and labor conflicts that we're already seeing today, and sort of the social upheaval that's going to come through these transitions. So I had some targeted ideas for where my world building needed to go, but I started with this book, at least I mostly started up front with that world building and a very loose plot, and I spent a lot of time revising that plot to kind of work together. But I made sure I'm pretty sensitive to dystopias, and I'm not a huge fan of them, honestly. People have still called my near futures dystopic, just because I think bad things are in there. But with Machinehood, I tried to present some things that were positive, ways in which people had, come up with more sustainable forms of energy, come up with eco-friendly buildings, other types of philosophies of living. There's this outside in lifestyle where people don't have doors or windows. They just let kind of nature creep into their houses. So I did my best, and like even daily conveniences, right? The primary point of view in the novel is a special forces action hero type of character, but the secondary point of view is very domestic, is a mother. And from her chapters, you really get to see, what some of those daily conveniences are: kitchens that cook for you, furniture that can rearrange itself, stuff like that. So I definitely wanted to kind of present a balanced depiction of 2095. Yes, there's plenty of bad stuff, but we're living through plenty of bad stuff. We always are, right? In any given decade, there are crises, there are challenges. And so for me, a dystopia is really, taking that to the extreme where there is nothing good. And honestly, to be truly dystopic, it should be implausible, right? So it's funny to me that a lot of people consider near future science fiction stories to be dystopic, because I think they're just realistic, and the audience just doesn't want to recognize the bad stuff that that we all have.
Mhm. So I'm sure we'll get back to your writing, but I want to talk about Escape Pod now, which is you're the co-editor of Escape Pod. I'm curious where you were in your creative life when Escape Pod came to you. When did this opportunity come to you?
I'm so sorry. I'm going to have you repeat that. I think my earbuds died.
Yeah, no problem. I was
switch audio.
It's all good. I was just talking about Escape Pod, and when this came to you, where you were as a creative, whenever the opportunity to co-edit Escape Pod came to you, and sort of what the decision-making process was for you to take that on.
I actually started as what's known as a slush reader for Escape Pod in March of 2015, kind of as I was entering that first dry spell of no sales. And I was invited to come and read submissions for them by someone in that online writers group I was in. And I decided I could fit it in. And the reason I wanted to fit it in was I had heard that reading submissions, if you're a short story writer, could help you improve your own craft. And so I figured it was worth my time to do that. And about a year later, I became the assistant editor, which meant taking the stuff that the slush readers had read and deciding what got passed on to the editor-in-chief and what got rejected. So that was an interesting, next step, right, towards that gatekeeping process of deciding, what gets published and what doesn't. And then about a year after that, I became editor, and I really wanted a co-editor at that point, even though that was 2017 and I didn't have any other work other than my novel, but I still had the kid and everything else, and I wanted backup. So I decided, so I asked Mer Lafferty, who had previously edited Escape Pod, if she would be willing to come back and co-edit with me. And thankfully she said yes, because she's awesome. She has a lot of experience and insight that really helped me. And so for the past 4.5 years now, I've been co-editor. And I think the biggest thing I've taken away from this experience has been just what a privilege it is to sit in an editor's chair and get to make these decisions on what gets published and what doesn't. And I think it's also a responsibility, especially right now with, so many things in flux these past 5 to 10 years in terms of the conversations that are happening about gatekeeping, for various marginalized and underrepresented populations, to really be cognizant of that and to try to improve the diversity of what gets out to our audience. And then the other half is just from a personal standpoint to recognize how truly subjective the editorial experience is, and therefore when my stuff does get rejected, to not take it so personally. I still obviously get frustrated and get those occasional bouts of despair at my own writing, but I also recognize, intellectually, that editors turn down stories for just a multitude of reasons, right? And so it doesn't actually reflect on the quality of my writing at this stage. And so, I love it. I have kind of grown into that role, and I've really appreciated the opportunities it's given me in terms of being able to find new authors, to start people's careers, to watch them, take off, whether it's people we've published, but also people on staff who come in as submissions readers have then gone on to excellent careers. So it's very gratifying.
And you brought this up a little bit. I'm curious though, because I always like to hear about the creative balance between being a writer and editor at the same time, because they're both such sort of free form positions where, you can devote your entire time to one or the other, and you have to balance both of them. Does your work as an editor, does it fit well with your work as a writer? I mean, I assume it does, because you've been doing it for so long, you're still enjoying it. Like, do they benefit? Do they help each other?
Yeah, I think so. Especially initially. At this point, I don't know that there's a lot of direct benefit on the craft of my writing. I think that was really the first couple of years where I saw, a lot of direct impact on understanding what works and doesn't work in short stories, but also what's likely to take a story past the slush pile, how critical it is to have that hook in the beginning, to have a very clean first few pages, to establish the conflict up front, and also equally on the other end, how critical it is to stick that landing at the end. And those kinds of small, craft related skill sets, I think I got out of the editorial process pretty early on. Now I think it's more the other way. It's what I can bring to the world of science fiction as an editor. And I love doing it. And I think because it's a short story and a podcast magazine, it's work, but I can generally silo that work at the right places in my week. So I have dedicated time still for my own writing, and my own writing, it always comes first in my mind, though Escape Pod definitely brings a chunk of responsibilities and a different kind of stress occasionally. Someone didn't get paid, or someone's byline was accidentally wrong. Stuff happens. Fires have to be put out. A narrator gets sick and can't complete their reading. You just got to scramble to find someone. That kind of management, I guess. That's also been interesting, because as an engineer, I never was a manager. And so I've really had to learn, how to manage a team, how to basically manage a business, even though we don't run for profit. But effectively, we are a professional operation. And so that comes with certain demands and standards. And it's been interesting to kind of take that journey in my writing half. And then, of course, there's the Escape Pod got its first Hugo nomination the year after Mara and I became co-editors. And that's been fantastic, because now I get to put Hugo nominated on my books, which is always fun. Runtime got the Nebula nomination, which was awesome. But having both now, getting to go to a Hugo Award ceremony and after party as a nominee was really special. So that's been another nice thing to come out of it, and very, very unexpected. I'm pretty sure Mara and I were literally screaming at each other on the phone the first time we got the notice.
And I realized I glanced over this and it came up in the Q&A, but if you don't mind, what is Escape Pod?
Oh, Escape Pod is a weekly science fiction podcast. It is the original science fiction podcast. It started in 2005, was founded by Sarah Ely. I joined 10 years into it. We are now up to episode 800 something, and we publish a short story, typically a short story every week, though the last couple of years we've been doing some multi-part longer pieces. And we operate like a magazine. So we have general open submissions for science fiction short stories between 1,500, 6,000 words. We pay SFWA professional rates. And if we decide, you go through the submissions process like you would with any short story magazine. And if we decide to buy your short story, we contract with you, you get paid. Then we find, and then so that the additional step we take, unlike a traditional literary magazine, is we have the podcast side. So we take your story, we find a narrator who we think is the perfect match for your main character's point of view. Sometimes we even have multiple narrators if there are multiple POVs in a story. And they read it sort of audiobook style, and then it goes out to 50 to 75,000 people who download it and listen to it on their podcatchers. And it's totally free to listen to. We take donations from our listeners to support all the business operations. And we now have a whole family of podcasts under an umbrella called Escape Artists that have a science fiction arm, which is Escape Pod, but also Podcastle for fantasy, Pseudopod for horror, and Cast of Wonders for young adults. So definitely go check it out. If you go to escapepod.org, you find links to all the other podcasts as well, and you can see what sort of stories Maura and I like to publish.
And then since we started Q&A, we might as well keep going because there's a few questions building up here. So first question, do you find it challenging to turn complex scientific concepts into understandable prose for all readers? Or perhaps it's one of the best parts of writing?
It is one of the best parts of writing science fiction for me, is trying to balance that need to deliver information without being stodgy or obviously info dumpy about it, but also it can be tricky, and you're never going to make everybody happy with whatever it is that you're writing. And so, some science fiction writers get deeply, deeply technical, and they have, they find their fans who love that. Some writers they basically gloss over it all, right? Like it's the Star Wars kind of approach to science fiction where we don't talk about how any of it works. It just works. And you're in it for the ride and for the fun. I try to kind of take a middle path just because, especially if I'm writing something that's more hard science fiction, I've done the research and in my head, I kind of know how it works. And so I want to give readers a little bit of a hint of that just because many of them do find it interesting. But it can also be dangerous to get too deep into it because at the end of the day, you're making something up and you're probably going to get something wrong. So one of my pieces of advice to people who always ask about, how do they balance it? I'm like, give a little, just enough to make it believable, but not so much that the expert who's reading your story is going to start calling you out on every mistake you made and how this will never, ever happen, because that's what pulls people out of the story. And so it's far better to keep them, locked into the plot and the characters suffering, and to keep them engaged in reading than to have them be like, what? Like, you can't build a device that's going to do that, So not that way, at least, right? So yeah, so it's definitely a tricky balancing act. And sometimes it also just depends on the project. Like right now I'm working on a short story for a futurist project for the government, and they want details, like actual like stuff that I was like, yeah, I don't need to put the exact numbers in. And the editors came back and said, no, we want the actual numbers, for these different things. Like how many people are going to die? How much is it going to cost? I'm like, okay. Like I have those numbers. I just, again, didn't want to put too much dry fact into the story. So it's very variable depending on the audience too.
Next question. I'm less than 1 year from retiring from tech to move full-time into writing. So this is great stuff. What mental challenges, esteem, confidence, etc., have you experienced making the transition, assuming money and healthcare are not stressors?
The hardest thing coming from tech, I think, is not having that obvious feedback of what works and what doesn't. That subjectivity I was talking about earlier, whether you're in code or mechanical engineering or electrical engineering, you build the thing and either it works or it doesn't. And that makes it a lot easier to know, whether you're on the right path. With writing, you're not going to know. And, however far, at least for the 8 years that I've been doing this, however far I've gotten, there's always still more to learn and things to improve on. And so I'm never 100% confident, like, yes, I got it. This is done. It's clean. I understand writing. I'm good to go. And so I think putting aside your ego and just kind of learning to go with the flow with writing is probably the hardest part, and really internalizing that it is a subjective process and that, yes, you should continue to improve your craft, you should hone your skills, but you should also not beat yourself up over every rejection. It doesn't mean that you've failed.
Next question. This is two similar questions, so I'm going to rope them both in here. Do you find you develop the plot first, or do you think of the character initially and let the plot develop, or both?
I have come up with what I call the triangle method of developing stories. I have three things, especially because it's science fiction. I have an idea for the world, I have character, and then I have plot. And I feel like they are three anchor points. I'm like, yeah, the triangle, there's your visual. And anytime you tweak one, it's going to pull on the others. So I tend to be somewhat iterative in my development. I would say, actually come up with the idea first. So for Machine Hood, the idea was, okay, this is going to be a book about AI and labor rights. Then characters, okay, who are the characters that are going to be affected by AI and labor rights, and whose stories do I want to tell? And then plot, from those characters and that stories, what is the plot that's going to allow me to tell the stories and to illustrate the idea? And then inevitably, then it goes back to, okay, so now I have these characters and plots, like what other ideas do I need to develop to support them? And then again, going back to revisiting the characters, like, okay, what is the backstory for these characters in order to support this plot and these ideas? And so I tend to be somewhat iterative in going around those three things until I'm kind of happy with the balance of all three.
And then a similar question here. Someone's asking, how do you develop your characters? Do you find it to be more challenging?
No, I tend to, when I was writing short stories in the beginning, I tended to be very character centric. I think I still do. Character arc matters more to me than plot for a short story. And so I definitely don't find it more challenging to develop characters. The way I do it is I tend to draw from people in real life, whether it's people I know personally or, stories I've read, news, features, that kind of thing. I'm always kind of collecting people's stories in my head. And then I think my characters end up being a little bit of a pastiche of, various different aspects of those people that I know. So even when, for example, with Machine Hood, the main character, Olga Ramirez, is this like ex-special forces badass, which I'm completely not. And I know a couple of Marines, but the only special forces person I know is like my mom's cousin, who's kind of an uncle of mine in India. And I've never really sat down and talked with him a ton. But I did my research, I did my reading, I interviewed people, whatever, to develop that aspect of the character. But I was able to throw in other fun stuff, like her love for cooking, which is something that I'm married to a gourmand, and I know several other people who that's what they do to relax, right? Or artwork, that this is a character who loves to draw, which is a thing my daughter likes to do. So I kind of pull in these little pieces to give that extra dimensionality and authenticity to the characters.
Mm-hmm. Next question. How many listeners did you say that Escape Pod has?
Oh, so I think our latest numbers is in terms of weekly downloads, we have something like 50 to 75,000. How many of them actually listen and when they listen is a little harder to know, but that many people are at least subscribed and engaged.
Mm-hmm. Next question. Do you have a favorite author or any favorite authors? Who do you like to read?
Yes. Lately, like newer favorite authors are Yoon-Ha Lee, Sarah Pinsker, Annalee Newitz, and Cameron Hurley. I also love Ken Liu's stuff and Ted Chiang's stuff. In my formative teenage years of reading science fiction, I was a gigantic Frank Herbert nerd. So, obviously with the new Dune movie, we're getting a whole new generation of fans there. But I read all his books. And CJ Cherryh, I loved her prose, read all her books. One of the best moments of my life since becoming a writer was I was at the Nebula conference when CJ Cherryh was given her Grandmaster Award by the SFWA. And I actually got to sit and talk with her and take a picture with her and hand her my novella, which was super cool. And then some other authors that I've loved, older authors are Joan D. Vinge. I really liked her stuff growing up. And of course, there's the ABC books, but I feel like everybody knows, Asimov, Bradbury, Clark, right? I find Bradbury has aged with me very well. I can still go back and read his stuff, and I love his writing and his prose. Asimov has not aged as well for me. I find his prose very clunky, and his characters are often very two-dimensional compared to what I like to write these days. And Clark is a mixed bag. So some of his stuff I still like, some of it I struggle with. But I always tell people, I'm you don't need to read the classics. There's so many fantastic new writers in the space of science fiction and fantasy that I really encourage all of you to kind of go discover them. You can find, if you just go and look at Wikipedia for Hugo and Nebula nominees over the past 5 years, there's just an incredible crop of new writers now who are pushing all kinds of boundaries.
And then last question is parting advice to people who want to get into full-time writing or want to sort of follow in the path that you've done. Anything that maybe you've learned now that you wish you would have known sooner, or just general thoughts of how people can achieve or get what they want out of their writing?
I think the biggest thing I've learned is perseverance. I've talked to, I don't know if anyone in this audience is familiar with the Murderbot Diaries books that Martha Wells has written. They've been very successful for her, but she's been writing for 20 or 30 years and, has published many books, but has also had dry spells of 3 or 4 years have gone by where she hasn't sold anything. And that's kind of been my own takeaway too, is like I said, there's those ups and downs, and the people who succeed are the ones who keep trying through it all. And when you're starting out, especially if you have that stable other job, it can be easy to turn away from writing. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? You can have a perfectly good life and a career not as a writer. But if you do want to pursue writing, if you do want to continue and you do want to get published, the best thing you can do is keep writing new stuff. The other thing is yes, you can sit and polish that one novel for 5 or 10 years. But your odds are better if you put it aside and write something else, because often the next thing that you write draws on all the lessons from the previous thing with none of the baggage, and you will write something better. You can always go back to the stuff that's trunked, dig it out, and publish it later. But yeah, just persist, just like sheer obstinate persistence in the face of rejections, and then keep taking classes, read books on craft, talk to your fellow writers, find a critique group if you can, take Gotham classes, like do what you need to do to continue improving your craft, because you do need to have those basics. That's something that you will legitimately get rejected for. You got to have your grammar, your typos. Your manuscript doesn't have to be 100% perfect, but if it's rife with errors, that's a load that the editor doesn't want to take on. So yeah, get your groundwork done, and then keep trying, keep stretching yourself, and it will probably happen. Everyone I've known who's persisted and improved, has eventually gotten published. So that's the takeaway. I wish someone had told me those first 6 months of like, oh my God, everyone's just, this is terrible. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. Maybe I'm not a good writer. When those thoughts crop up, inevitably, just keep going.
And lastly, what do you have to promote, and where can people find you online? I know you've got some books handy, so it's show and tell time.
All right, well, I'll show off this year's most important book, which is Machinehood, which I'm still super excited about. You can find it anywhere, everywhere, in audio, hardcover. Paperback's coming in March of next year. Please buy it if you think you even kind of like science fiction. It's not way out there. It's very grounded and readable. And same with Runtime, which is my novella. So this was my first publication. And I don't think we talked about this, but I have a short story collection that was published first in India and is available worldwide now, as well as the Escape Pod anthology, which I see on Josh's shelf, which we published last year for our 15th anniversary. It's possibly the one and only time you're going to see our stuff in print. You can find me on Twitter as @Divya's Tweets. I'm mostly on Twitter. I'm occasionally on Instagram as @SBDivya_author. And my website is sbdivya.com, very easy. And if you like Machinehood and AI stuff, there's some goodies on the Machinehood website. So you can go to machinehood.com for that.
Awesome. And all the books that she mentioned, Escape Pod, all of that, we're going to include that in the show notes. So to all of our listeners, you will have links to that soon. Divya, thank you so much for being here today. This was fantastic.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Of course. And to all of our listeners, we'll be back. Actually, we have a special episode tomorrow on sensitivity readers. So you can sign up for that on the Gotham website. And then next week, Wednesday, we're back and we're going to be talking to Ken Davenport. So we will see you then. Thanks for being here.
Bye.